Okay, so you've had a chance to analyze the Weaver case. Let's just start with kind of my list, some things that I noticed. Under rule-based reasoning, he did a really nice job of characterizing facts, and he showed a strong connection, and then he actually used some reasoning by implying. And I'll show you those in the case. And then for reasoning by analogy, he did a great job of contrasting what happened in knots. And I'll show you more of that. And then there's a counterpoint here, which is you may not have believed his characterization that the GPS tracker gave vastly more information. And if you thought that, then he needed to give more examples. I'm sorry, if you thought that, he needed to give more examples to convince you of that. Okay, so let's pull up the opinion here. So the first bit is just like getting the facts down. And then he does a nice job of doing, this is a rule explanation of knots. He explains knots. You see here the rule statement, the facts, the holding, and the reasoning. And then this is where the judge's reasoning actually begins here at first blush. And this, when you write, this is a good place to write your conclusion again, your prediction in the memo. You would write, the GPS tracker is an unreasonable invasion of somebody's privacy, therefore it's an unreasonable search. So you'd put the conclusion right here. But what he's doing is actually a nice technique of getting out of the way any obvious points. And so he actually starts with his counter argument. He points out what things are similar between knots in our case. So I've told you, you always start with your argument in chief, and then you do a counter argument, and then explain away that counter argument. Well, he had just a really quick counter argument, and then the rest of it was all his own argument. So he just got it, done with at the beginning. So you could certainly do something like that, but just make very clear what your prediction is. Okay, all along the way, the reader needs to know the prediction. Okay, so then when he starts his actual argument here, knots involve the use of what we must now know, or we recognize that it's a very primitive tracking device. Okay, so he's characterizing the beeper. So while he's doing his reasoning by analogy here, he's contrasting knots. He's characterizing the facts in knots versus, in a minute here, he's going to contrast them with a characterization of our case. So up here he says it's very primitive, and then look down here. It's the GPS is sophisticated and powerful technology. It's vastly different. So these are all just characterizations of it. The mirror beeper. It facilitated visual surveillance. Okay, so one of my first points here is he's doing a nice job of contrasting. But then under rule-based reasoning, he's repeating some of the law here. Some of the law was augmenting the sensory faculties. That's okay. If you're just merely augmenting sensory faculties, that's okay. But down here, he's like, this does a lot more than just facilitate visual surveillance. Facilitate visual surveillance is just another way of saying augmenting the sensory faculties and observing what's happening. So he's just taking the rule from knots and applying it, just using slightly different words. Okay, so that shows a connection between the case law and our case. So you want to show the connection. And then here he characterizes how the GPS is different. He explains it's more accurate. He uses accurate and precise. Those are all, he's going to how this isn't some clunky dot on a screen that doesn't show much detail. Instead, a GPS shows an incredible precision. So that is characterizing the facts. And then here's some reasoning by implication. This is hypothesis. He's saying if you were, to make the point that this isn't a mere enhancement of faculties of your sensory capacity, he's saying you would need millions of police officers with cameras at every street lamp, observing every little move that you make. So again, he's proving it's precise. It's more than just sensory capacity. So this hypothesis kind of explaining like, hey, if if this were the situation, then you would need this. That's a hypothesis. That's a kind of a story you're making up to make a point. That's a hypothesis, when you make up a story to make your point. Okay, and then here we get to a very strong connection with the law, the reasonable notion of personal privacy. This is the element actually being applied here. If you don't have a reasonable expectation of privacy or notion of privacy, then it's going to be a violation. Okay, so what the police may learn, that's a big part of it. So he's making a strong connection. That's under rule-based reasoning. He's characterizing everything that the GPS tracker will get is indisputably private in nature. And then here, this is reasoning by implication. He's saying, if we allow these GPS trackers to be on basically everybody's cars, and the police force, the government, the FBI, the CIA, whoever, if they're allowed to track people, here are some examples of, what they could learn. So this is the implication of the rule. What the one party would argue, what the government wants. Here's the implication of what one party wants. That's a type of reasoning. The implication is you're going to have some embarrassing stuff about you, potentially embarrassing stuff, unless you want all this stuff out there, but I don't think most people do. Most people, when they go to a plastic surgeon, they're probably not shouting that from the rooftops. If you go to an AIDS treatment center, you're probably going to be discreet about that. Even if you go to dialysis for kidneys, because you're embarrassed you have diabetes or whatever. So anyway, that's reasoning by implying. That's great stuff there. And then here we have multiple GPS devices are utilized, even more precisely resolved inferences about our activities. Inferences, that's the point. You infer from where people go what's going on in their private life. And then here to kind of summarize, he just gets right to it. And here he's characterizing how the GPS just gives so much information. He covers the who, when, and what. Like a reporter's supposed to ask the 5 W's. Well, here he's like, here's the 3 main ones. Who you're with, who you're not with, like if you're, out on a dalliance or something. When you're with them and when you're not with them. What you're doing. I mean, everything is exposed. So that's kind of his point. Now, the counter-analysis, and this is my final point here. You may not have been convinced by his analysis. When I was reading it, I thought, I'd like to know more what the beeper technology actually gives, because I think with the beeper technology, you could probably figure out more. But he didn't do a good job, I don't think, of describing how clunky the beeper technology was. So we just have to trust him that it's a lot more clunky than a GPS tracker. But I think he could have given some examples, like with a beeper, here's what it could tell you. But with the GPS, here's the additional information it could tell you. That would make it an even better analysis, in my opinion. Okay, so the writer here did a nice job of doing both contrasting the Knott's case and at the same time weaving within the analogy a whole bunch of rule-based reasoning. So anyway, do the same on your closed memo, your open memo, your 2 email memos, and when you reason on your essays and your other classes at the end of this term, and you will be mightily rewarded. Okay, I'll see ya.